If you value thoughtful, honest conversations about the Orthodox world, subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. You'll get frequent essays, episode notes, and occasional behind-the-scenes reflections that expand on what you hear on this podcast. It's free to join, and if you choose a paid plan, you directly support independent Jewish media and help keep me producing these conversations. Paid subscribers to Orthodox Conundrum Commentary also get this episode ad-free with bonus content and early access. That bonus conversation is available for paid subscribers to Orthodox Conundrum Commentary on Substack. In today's bonus segment, I'll be asking Rabbi Blau, what religious or philosophical question do you answer differently now than you did 10 or 20 years ago? And what changed to make you think about it in a different manner? Take 10 seconds right now to search for Orthodox Conundrum Commentary on Substack and hit subscribe, or click on the link in the description of this podcast. Thank you for being part of this community and helping us grow. Now, let's begin today's episode about confronting extremism from within our own community with Rabbi Yitzchak Blau.
It is possible that religious communities struggle more. Let's say a lot of Jews are doing the wrong thing. So does that come out as a critique of Jews or of Judaism? And if we think it's a critique of Judaism, I'm wondering, maybe we're more reluctant. No, but Judaism is this, divine system, and it can't be messed up by people, and therefore we really shouldn't admit to any problems. But I understand it, but it's really an error. There's no system where you can't technically be within the rules and really do something totally immoral against the values of the system. So I think at that point, we have to really realize, we could still defend Judaism, but that doesn't mean that, rabbis throughout the centuries always made the right call, or Orthodox Jews throughout the centuries always made the right call.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. This is the Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. I want to begin today by reading a short report published last night in the Times of Israel. 2 young men were hospitalized with gunshot wounds this afternoon after settlers attacked the Palestinian compound of Abu Hammam on the outskirts of Ramallah, according to the Palestinian Red Crescent Society. One young woman from the compound, interviewed at the hospital, said that a settler punched her in the face, knocked her down, and kicked her while her small daughter stood beside her. They were beating us and shooting us, she said. I hid my father behind me. I said, let them beat me and not him. In separate footage she filmed, she claimed that homes were robbed and that, quote, they left nothing, but thank God we're okay. Now, I want to be very clear. I don't know exactly what happened there. No one does. Reports in a conflict zone are typically incomplete, very often biased, especially when Israel's involved, frequently wrong, and deprived of context. But I also think that many of us can predict the immediate reactions this kind of story produces in our communities. First, she's lying or exaggerating. Second, we don't know the backstory. And third, even if this happened exactly as described, these are fringe, crazy people who do not represent us. And perhaps some or all of those reactions are understandable. Jews today often correctly feel unfairly judged, and Israel certainly faces scrutiny that is so often dishonest and disproportional. But I've been wondering whether these responses, even when sincere, sometimes allow us to end a conversation that we need to have before it really begins. Because if the people involved truly do not represent us, then a harder question follows. What responsibility does the mainstream nevertheless bear when stories like this keep appearing? How does a Torah community respond to allegations of wrongdoing from within its own world, not only by defending itself, but by asking what honesty, responsibility, and moral clarity require? Today, I'll be discussing these issues with Rabbi Yitzchak Blau. Our goal is not to reach a verdict on any single incident. It's about something deeper: how religious communities confront uncomfortable claims, how we can distinguish skepticism from denial, and what Torah leadership looks like when loyalty and truth stand against each other in a state of tension. And we'll get to that conversation in just a moment. First, Remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Finally, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast, and JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Rabbi Yitzchak Blau is Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshivat Oraita and also teaches at Midreshet Lindenbaum. He is the author of Fresh Fruit and Vintage Wine, The Ethics of the Agadah, and of the forthcoming Methodology and Meaning, The World of the Agadah, as well as many articles on Jewish thought, including ethics, Zionism, Bible, Jewish education, and 20th century rabbinic thinkers. Rabbi Blau serves as an associate editor of Tradition Journal. Rabbi Yitzchak Blau, thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Always a pleasure to be here.
When troubling incidents occur, the Orthodox mainstream often says that the people who do these acts, like the ones I mentioned in my introduction, don't represent us. I want to ask you, Rabbi Blau, what does that statement accomplish, and what does it actually sometimes prevent us from accomplishing?
Okay, so I'm going to outline two reasons why I am not in favor of that approach. One, I think very often the extremes reflect the mainstream. I mean, the extremes are only going to go so far past the mainstream. So therefore, the mainstream position does, in fact, impact on the extremists. I'll go a step further. Sometimes there's a certain rhetoric that the mainstream uses that feeds the extremists, meaning the mainstream people would not actually engage in acts of violence themselves, but they don't realize how their rhetoric leads to it. So let's do two examples. We'll talk about the Haredi community and the Noar Gvaot. Okay, so
which means the settler youth, the people who are committing the acts in the West Bank right now.
Correct. So the Haredi community, I agree, most Haredim would not dream of, lighting fire to a police motorcycle or things like that. But if your rhetoric talks about the government as shmad, meaning as a persecuting foreign government, that they're persecuting you when they try to enlist you in the army, so that sets a tone, that sets a stage. And an extremist then works off that. Wait, if they're really, Tsarist Russia, so you could be violent against Tsarist Russia. So I think there, again, I think the rhetoric of the mainstream has an influence. I would suggest the same thing with those that are attacking random Palestinians. Let's say that the religious Zionist world always talks about, I'm exaggerating, I'm just for an example, always talks about Gentiles in a negative way. Now, again, I don't think this is true. I think it's a bit more complex than that. But let's say there's this extra emphasis on the badness of the non-Jewish world. So at that point, again, someone would feel less restrained about attacking a random Palestinian. Because if all non-Jews really hate us, if they're all really out to get us, so maybe they deserve it. So I think that's the first point. I think the mainstream should not be so quick to wash its hands because there is a certain amount of responsibility. Secondly, and this is a point you made when you sent me questions, I think there is a sense of collective responsibility in this world, even when you're not personally responsible. Like we don't only have, now again, I think modern liberals are not so adamant about this, but I once read a great philosophy article by a guy named John Keeks, where he pointed out that the liberals themselves function this way, meaning we don't only have a personal identity, we all have a communal identity also. And Keeks had a great example. Many liberal Americans feel guilty about slavery, and therefore we have to compensate the African American community, the Black community. Now, they might be right, but you can't say that if you're only focused on personal responsibility. Like, if you grew up in the 21st century, like you didn't do anything, right? So at that point, you must be saying, no, I'm part of a collective. The collective has an identity in how it functions. And I would like to repair any harm that that collective did. So I think most of us function that way. Now, again, obviously, we don't want to ignore individual responsibility, but there is also a sense of collective responsibility. So I would say, even if the Haredim and the Dati Lumi world are not playing a causal role in the violence, since these extremists are identified with the community, I think that does create some kind of obligation to act.
It's interesting that you mentioned how saying it's not our responsibility does not divorce you from the consequences of the rhetoric you use in other contexts. I actually wrote a Substack article this past week about Cardinal Holland. I don't know if that's how you pronounce his name, but he was the primate in Poland before and during World War II, the Catholic primate. And he was very clear. He wrote pastoral letters saying that attacking Jews is absolutely wrong. He also, in sometimes the same letters, would say how terrible the Jews are. And the problem is most people don't have the psychological capability to separate those. It's more, as one commentator says, than the human mind is able to do in most cases, to be able to say, well, I understand these are the worst people on earth, but I have to be nice to them. That is asking the human psyche to do more than it's capable of.
Yeah, it's just you say that, Martin Gilbert has a book where he outlines the stories of various righteous Gentiles. And one that always struck me, there was a Polish woman who belonged to an anti-Semitic organization who saved Jews. And now, obviously, one counterexample does not disprove your point at all. But I always find it so striking. She basically said, okay, I don't like Jews, but I don't want to kill them. I don't want to round them up and shoot them. But you're right, though. For many people, once you're saying how bad they are, like the next steps beckon.
One of the most famous examples is actually Pope Pius XI, who was the Pope before the Holocaust really started. Pope Pius XII became Pope in 1939. And Pope Pius XI was so upset at the anti-Semitism, he wrote a letter that was going to condemn anti-Semitism, and it was suppressed by his successor. And he did not suppress it because of the following, but people say, and I've actually heard this said, thank God it was never released, because it so denigrated Jews in the context of saying, but you can't kill them or oppress them, that yatzas charo b'hefsedo, so to speak. It would have been a negative altogether.
Wow, okay, I did not know about that. I'll have to track it down and read it.
Yeah, the Lost Encyclical of Pius XI is often what it's called. Okay, at what point, Rabbi Blau, does the fringe stop being somebody else's problem and become our problem? You already said that we can't divorce ourselves from the rhetoric, and if it's our community, we have collective responsibility. At the same time, someone can say, that's not my community. I have nothing to do with the Noar HaGvaot. I have nothing to do with people who are attacking female soldiers. And in fact, by saying it is my community, you're saying negative things about me, which are not true. When do we say, no, that is my problem?
Look, that's a fair question. I guess I would say that we all live in a series of concentric circles where we have stronger and less strong identity with other people in the circle. So on one extreme would be, I guess, the world, humanity. Like you and I are part of humanity. And maybe, if humanity is ruining the environment, we have to act. Okay, fine. And at the other end would be, let's say immediate family, right? Nuclear family. So there we have, the strongest connection, the strongest sense of unified identity. But then as one moves to the middle, I think there are stronger and weaker forms. So it's true, someone who's Haredi might feel more identification with the extremist and therefore might bear greater responsibility. At the same time, what if we draw the circle at Orthodox Jewry? Right, if we draw the circle there, and I think to some degree it is true. Like it's true that I identify more with other modern Orthodox Jews, but I can't say I don't identify at all with the larger world of Orthodoxy. So at that point, it is my circle. Again, it's not my circle as intensely as the family unit, the nuclear family, but it is my circle in a real way, and it's my circle in a more significant way than, let's say, all Jews or all of humanity. So I think, again, I know it's hard to pin it down to exact numbers in this kind of thing, but I do think we could talk about a scale of responsibility, a scale of identification. And I do think that you and I, even if we're not part of the Haredi world, but it's part of the Orthodox orbit. And therefore, we want to, if we can, we want to do something about it.
At the same time, I question whether I agree fully with you, even though implicitly I think I do, only because I think about the people that, for example, those people in Bnei Brak last week were attacking. They were female soldiers. It could have been my own kid. Frankly, it could have been me or you in some ways. And in that sense, if we're the ones they're attacking, it's not as though they're attacking not religious Jews. Maybe they're not religious in their viewpoint, but the people they're attacking are, whether it's Orthodox or not, soldiers and people who support the IDF. Therefore, you and I, as people who say far more members of the Haredi community should go to the army, and we demonstrate that ourselves and that we send our own kids to the army. So for us to say al-Chet or ashamnu for something that is almost the opposite of our message seems to be counterintuitive.
Okay, it occurs to me now that I should have made a second point, which is until now I've been talking about degree of responsibility based on level of identification. But there's also a question of where one's efforts can even be helpful. And I think it makes sense that most of us, if I went through all those circles again, the more intensely you identify, usually the more impact you could have. Right. I think it's true, even though, I have a lot of critiques of the creative world and I do write about them sometimes. I'm not sure I can really impact on it. Right. They're certainly not reading me with an eye towards, oh, how do I improve the community? And at that point, I don't think I could have much impact. Whereas, interestingly enough, even though I don't really identify, actually, I don't identify in the slightest with people who are attacking random Palestinians, in theory, I could have more impact because they're part of this larger religious Zionist community. And I talk to my neighbors in Shul. I write, let's say, in Makar Rishon, which is read by the community. So there, I do have an outlet to have an impact. So I would say another reason why, beyond your point, that can we really say Ashamnu in this case, I'd say we'll have to ask where we could be effective. And the closer we are to the people who are extreme, right, the more effective we could be. So it seems to me that I can impact on the religious Zionist world much more than I can impact on the Haredi world.
And now I'm going to say the opposite side, even though I realize I'm contradicting myself. You and I have both written about some of the issues that aren't part of the religious Zionist world. They're part of the Haredi world. I don't necessarily think that's unfair because people at times will say, how do I answer the arguments of those people who are disagreeing with us? So yes, it may not be that we're impacting the Haredi world, but it could be that we are actually impacting our own world and giving them, I hope, tools with which to defend themselves.
Oh, I totally agree. And I'll endorse your point and add one other. You are right. It is quite interesting. I think more in America, a lot of modern Orthodoxy looks over its shoulder and says the real thing is going on to our right, right? The Haredim, they're the real Judaism, but we water it down a bit. I think that happens less in Israel, but I can't say it doesn't happen at all. Okay, it probably happens less because the Dati Leumi world is very into, Zionism and the army, and they view that as a superior thing that they do. But it exists here also. And you're right. Even if we're not going to change the Haredi world, I think we need to understand why we don't agree with them. Okay, so I totally agree with that. I'll also say a step further, it could influence decisions we make. Okay, as our listeners probably know, one of the huge debates in the Dati Leumi world right now is, should we, as it were, appease the Haredim to maintain this right-wing government? Or should we say, no, it's too much that they won't go to the army, that they want money for their educational institutions, and therefore we should let the government collapse, right? We should let the government come down. That is the better of the alternatives. And I think evaluating the Haredi world does depend on this conversation to some degree. Like what's going on there? How problematic is it? So I think you're right, beyond what I said earlier in the day about influence, where we have less influence there. Sometimes we're influencing our community's attitude to a different world. And sometimes that could influence a very, very practical decision, right? To some degree, that's the decision of the day right now, right? Should we vote for this Chok HaGiyos or vote against it and bring down the government?
Okay, now let's talk about what we can do as opposed to what's wrong to do, just saying, well, that's not us. How about proper condemnation? What would that even consist of? Meaning, let's say, for example, there's a rabbi with a pulpit or a teacher with a classroom, and he wants to say what those violent settler youth are doing is completely unacceptable. What exactly should he do so that it's not merely symbolic and just virtue signaling, so to speak, but instead actually can accomplish something?
So let's differentiate between public statements and ongoing educational ventures. In terms of public statements, so I would say many of us, just if we get our lone voice, are not so effective. I think there are people who have, greater impact and greater respect in the community. And if they say something, if Rav Druckerman came out against Baruch Goldstein, that has impact. Okay, he doesn't have to be part of a larger unit. But I think in many other cases, I think the sense of, oh, here are 20 rabbis whose names I know who are speaking out, maybe there is something to it. And I would say that unfortunately, sometimes it's easier to get rabbis for things that are much more problematic. Okay, I can't remember the fellow's name, but one Israeli who's in jail for murdering a Palestinian boy. So there was complaints about his prison conditions. And then I remember there's a rabbinic letter in the newspaper that we should improve this fellow's prison conditions. It's unfair. Now, prison reform might be a great cause, but I never saw these rabbis talking about prison reform before. And one wonders if they're really sending a message that, violence against Arabs is not such a big deal. So I keep thinking, like, how could it be that we can get, 30 rabbis to sign that, but we can't get 30 rabbis to sign a letter about not persecuting random Palestinians? I will say, though, to be fair, the rabbis of the Shomron did come out with a letter recently. Okay, I didn't study it that carefully, but thank God there is a letter. But so I would say we want significant rabbis to speak up and rabbis to form a collective and speak up. Obviously, you could do this in an organizational setting. Tzohar rabbis could speak up or things like that. And I would say also, I think we do need, like, rabbis need to be a little bit courageous, meaning usually in this context, someone's going to be angry with you, and whichever way you go. Because usually there are hotheads on, every political side in your shul or in your classroom. And it's, easier to just be quiet. It's easier to not say anything or to talk about, Achdus and Avos Yisrael. That's an easier message, but not in this context necessarily the message you need to be sounding. So I think that's, again, the first category is public messaging. And with the courage to face criticism, rabbis have to be willing to face criticism. But secondly, and maybe this really gets at your question, I think a lot of it is actually your ongoing day-to-day conversations and what happens in the classroom. Like, let us say, I don't know, you're a 10th grade teacher. Okay, but you encounter your 10th grade students every day. And the attitude, again, we don't expect you to give political speeches, but the attitude you project can make an impact. And I know, let's say you hear a boy making a joke about, beating up Arabs, right? So either you say that's inappropriate or you ignore it. Those opportunities, those things happen all the time, I think. And even if you tell me, but what if I'm not in education? Okay, but like you go to shul, like the guy next to you in shul says something, right? You have people for Shabbos lunch and things come up. And that maybe in some ways is even more effective. Like obviously you don't have the broad reach of a public lecture or public statement by a significant person. But, life is also made up of, millions of small acts. So I would say someone who really cares, like, speak up and not just speak up. It's not just protesting. It's like, conveying values. Like say in the classroom, there are good non-Jews also, and we can't assume they're all out to kill us.
I wonder if sometimes we have to do more than speak, Rabbi Blau. I agree with everything that you said. And I also wonder if a rabbi, for example, in a shul, if there are people who are supportive of this kind of violence, he tells them, until you change your tune publicly, you're not welcome to come into our synagogue. We know there are certain things that people say them. A shul will say, please don't be part of our community. And the question is, why don't we do that for people who are actively and verbally promoting violence? And maybe some are.
Look, that's a great question. Obviously, the dilemma of when to tell someone they're not welcome in shul is really a conundrum. And I think, I really have to think about it, but I think that our default position is that the person could come. We disapprove of them, but they could come. And I can think of like rare instances where we're on the other side of the divide. Like if you have a person who is like leaving his wife in Naguna, indeed, they should not be allowed into shul. Right. If you have somebody who's, abusing children and is not, in court, I think at that point also, like they can't come to shul. How far to expand that, though, is really a difficult question. And I guess, Rav Scott, part of the problem is that there's a whole scale even among support. Like, let's say too many of my neighbors voted for Itamar Ben-Gvir. Okay, but I'm not going to kick them out of shul because they didn't do that because Ben-Gvir liked Baruch Goldstein, right? They did it for whatever reason, right? So then let's move the needle a little bit. So then you have people who think that let's say someone says the following: it is wrong to attack random Palestinians, but it's not the issue of the day, right? There are other issues that are more pressing. So again, I think that's ethically problematic, but we're not going to kick them out of shul. Now, again, you said, well, what about someone who's actively promoting violence? But again, I guess I'd have to think about like, how do you define that? Again, because you could keep moving the needle a little bit, and it's not so clear at what point you say they're actively promoting violence. So again, I guess what I'm saying is I agree with you in principle that there should be a level of discourse where you can't come to shul anymore. But in practice, I'm not so sure how to identify those people.
I understand what you mean. It was sort of more of a theoretical question. I guess part of the problem becomes this cowardice issue, you say. I'm not saying that it's cowardice not to expel people, but too often I feel that sometimes leadership does not want to offend and therefore couches terms in all sorts of, well, I don't know if it's true, and well, he didn't really mean it, or whatever else. I guess part of the issue has to be sort of encouraging courage that we often don't see. At least it seems that way to me.
Yeah, I'll agree with you. And I think you hit the nail on the head. If you really think your community is doing something wrong, it doesn't always have to be couched together with, and the other side has a problem. And not because the other side doesn't have a problem. Of course it does. But it kind of waters down your critique. And meaning someone could say, yes, there are Jewish acts of terror against Palestinians, but it doesn't compare to the number of Palestinian acts of terror against Jews. And it's actually true. That is true. But it's not helpful in this context. Right. In this context, if you really want to come down against Jewish violence, so just say that you'll find some other time to, talk about the unfortunate level of Palestinian violence.
Now I'm going to ask the question, which probably is almost offensive, but in case anybody listening is wondering this, there are probably some people who will say, yes, violence in theory is wrong, but you know what? Violence against Palestinians in this context, after 2.5 years of war, is very different because we have to show them something. We have to take vengeance of some sort in order to make sure that they know that Jewish blood isn't cheap. If they are going to kill us, we are going to kill them. I absolutely, without qualification, reject that argument, but I'd like to hear you say something similar to explain why that is a bad argument.
Okay, so I think it's bad both ethically and even practically. Ethically, the ends don't always justify the means. Now, I'm not saying they never do, but very often in life, it might be beneficial on some level to do X, but we just can't do it. Okay, I'm not going to get into a longer ethical philosophical conversation here, but I'll just posit that. I guess if need be, I can go into it further. But just say, A, the ends do not always justify the means. Number two, at some point, it becomes an endless argument, meaning, wait, you're saying if we really smash them, then they'll stop bothering us? What have we done the last over 2 years? Again, even by our accounting, we killed, I don't know, more than 60,000 Palestinians. We devastated Gaza. Like, what do we need to do? Like, oh, that's not called smashing them. If we, steal some sheep in Shechem, then they'll stop, right? It doesn't seem quite reasonable at all. And again, I'm not suggesting that what we did in Gaza was wrong. I'm just suggesting that it seems to be kind of like a foolish assertion, right? If we, I often feel sometimes that both the right and the left in Israel have like an endless answer, but an endless answer that's just false. Like the left will always say, but we didn't make enough concessions, right? If we had only made the right concessions, then we'd have a peace partner. And the right can always say, we just didn't use enough force. But if you could always say that, maybe you have to question it a little bit. Maybe it's really not a good argument.
Yeah, I have to say that I smile ruefully when I sometimes hear people in the government say, if name the enemy here does that, they'll really see what we're capable of. You're like, okay, maybe, but I thought you did that already. And that's, maybe you're right. I don't mind it. But sometimes it just sounds silly to a certain point. You're going to do the same thing again, but fine. Now, part of the problem with the story of settler violence, let's say, against Palestinians is that there have been situations where later on we find out that context really was missing. That, for example, maybe there was violence, but they were attacked first. They were defending themselves. Those are not impossible. Those have happened. So when we do read or hear negative reports, and we naturally assume bias or distortion, that's not totally out of the question. So how can we be skeptical without necessarily going into reflexive denial in a way that's not healthy?
Look, that's also a great question. I'm wondering, because what you said before about the capacity of human being to have conflicting impulses, I think we might have to call for it here, despite the difficulty. Meaning, I think we do have to be open to the fact that sometimes there is a bias at work, and yet realize that that cannot possibly cover every single case of violence. And how to, keep those two together is not so easy. One might be not to respond immediately, like maybe wait a week to see what comes out. Another might be, of course, ask yourself who the sources of information are. So if you're getting information from, I don't know, Haaretz or Jewish Voice for Peace, so you have a big suspicion, right? They might be out to make Israel look bad, to make the settlers look bad, etc. But if you're getting a report from the army, I don't think it's true. Meaning, again, the real conspiracy theorists will say, "Oh, even the army's out to get us." But that's an army that's protecting you also. I don't think it's so reasonable to say that everybody in the army is out just to besmirch the name of Jews over the Green Line or of Jews who are in Palestinian villages. So at that point, it seems to me it becomes extremely difficult to say that it is all a conspiracy. So I agree there is a dilemma here, and I have to admit I've struggled with it myself a little bit. But I say we would have to be able to both realize that sometimes things are exaggerated and yet realize that we genuinely have a problem.
Now, I'm wondering why you think it sometimes is so difficult for communities, whoever they are, to confront internal failure. On some level, it would seem that aside from saying they're not part of us, to say, yes, this was a failure would actually be the smart thing to do. We see it throughout Tanakh, in fact. It's constant. It's probably the main theme in the Nevi'im is that there is an internal communal failure that we must address, and pretending it's not there is going to lead to disaster. Why do people find it so hard to do that?
Again, I'm going to raise two answers, one that's universal and one that's particular to religion. I think one would have to admit, I think you have to be careful sometimes because I have a lot of critiques of the religious community, but very often, if you really deepen your analysis, it's really a critique of humanity, meaning human beings struggle with a lot of things, and religious Jews and religious people struggle with those same things. If I could use another example for a second, it's not our question, but I think it really illustrates the point. If you look at the history of dealing with sexual abuse, it's amazing how cover-ups seem to appear in every community, right? Obviously, we've had our problem in Orthodox Judaism. Okay, we could then look at the Catholic Church, which has arguably been much worse. Okay, we could then go to the Penn State football team, where also there was a cover-up. We could then go to Hollywood, where like Harvey Weinstein's behavior was like an open secret for years, but nobody dealt with it. I could give more examples, but I think the point is made, meaning people struggle to admit weakness, people struggle to admit failure, or to take on responsibility, or as we said before, or to be courageous in the face of criticism. And that's going to transcend any group. That's going to transcend every community. So at that point, I think, unfortunately, Orthodox Jewry is like the rest of the world. Okay, we would like to think that we're not responsible. We would like to think that we don't have to do anything. We don't have to speak up. I will add, though, it is possible that religious communities struggle more. And here, I often wonder about this. Let's say a lot of Jews are doing the wrong thing. So does that come out as a critique of Jews or of Judaism? And if we think it's a critique of Judaism, I'm wondering, like, maybe we're more reluctant. So, no, but Judaism is this, divine system, and it can't be messed up by people. And therefore, we really shouldn't admit to any problems. But I would say I understand it, but it's really an error. Meaning, you could have, I often say this also, like when people complain that someone could like find loopholes in the halakha, I always say you could find loopholes in any system. There's no system where you can't technically be within the rules and really do something totally immoral against the values of the system. So I think at that point, I think we have to really realize, we could still defend Judaism, but that doesn't mean that, rabbis throughout the centuries always made the right call. Or Jews or Orthodox Jews throughout the centuries always made the right call. So I'd say if we could overcome those two things, again, the difficulty all of humanity has, and specifically a realization that, you could be part of a religious community and believe in the sanctity of the Torah and still see deep flaws in the community, I think we'd be in a much healthier place. Okay, let me throw in a third. Sorry, Rev Scott, let me just throw in a
Please.
third. I think also, you see, it's good when I discuss with you, like new ideas come to mind. I think also there's a problem if anyone feels that they're a community under siege. because then you really don't admit anything. How could I admit anything? Like I'm being under attack. I'm being under attack. I'm under attack. And one of the things I think is amazing in Israel, sometimes I feel like every community feels like they're under siege, right? The Haredim think they're under siege, right? The leftist intellectuals think they're under siege, right? The Russians think they're under siege. The Ethiopians think they're under siege. The Israeli Arabs think they're under siege. Like at some point, it becomes like absurd. Like how could it be that everybody is under siege, but somehow I think that's the impression people give. And when you're under siege, you don't give in, or at least you're tempted not to give in. So that I think is really a problem that we have to overcome. I think the Haredi community is a great example. Like after World War II, they indeed were this small minority where the majority thought they're just going to go away. Okay, we could kind of let them be, and they'll just we don't have to take them seriously. And okay, that's great, but that's not the mode of functioning. When you have 400 yeshiva guys leaving, you're not going to the army. That's not the mode of function when you have 70,000 yeshiva guys not going to the army. But a lot of these groups have not woken up to the fact that they should not be functioning as a minority under siege.
Yeah, in fact, a friend of mine mentioned that the issue with the Haredim and the army, it's absolutely true that in 1950, the army was an instrument of socialization and was trying to make people less religious. Absolutely. If we deny that, we're denying history. And it's also true that that is not true in 2026. And this friend of mine who has children who are Haredim in the army in Hashmonaim was arguing that it's sort of like those, I assume it's not apocryphal, those stories of these Japanese fighters who were living in the jungles of wherever 20 years after the conclusion of World War II, who somehow hadn't heard that the war was over. And someone finds them in 1965 and tells them, the war is over. You don't have to fight that fight anymore. The emperor no longer is in charge and the war is finished. And on some level, the Haredim who are arguing about how terrible the army is, because of the reasons that were true in Ben Gurion's day, you're fighting a war that has been since resolved in your favor. It's kind of silly.
Yeah, just to pick up on your point, I totally agree. Again, let me say first, it's not, of course, it's true that sometimes the army can be difficult religiously. And of course, it's true they're not always sensitive. But again, like you're saying, there is no comparison between the current situation and 1952. I don't have the quote in front of me, but Yehuda Yifrach wrote in Makar Rishon a couple of weeks ago. I thought he had a great paragraph. Basically, the religious Zionist community is so, thank God, so idealistic about the army, and mechinot such as Atzmon and Eli have a tremendous amount of graduates becoming officers. He said, like, when he does Miluim today, he feels like he's at an Eli reunion. Like, that's what it feels like. It does not feel like I'm entering secular Tel Aviv and being made fun of. So I think your point is totally on target.
And what you said in terms of your second point about how religions often feel that if our people do something wrong, then there's something wrong with the religion, with, for example, in this case, Judaism. I completely agree, and I feel that's so unfortunate and so wrongheaded when it comes specifically to Judaism. That is not historically what Judaism did. The Nevi'im, as I said earlier, said that you're doing incorrect things and therefore you're violating what God wants, not that your misbehavior is some sort of indictment of God or Torah or Judaism as such. It's an indictment of the Jewish people trying to implement that Torah. I would argue that the story of Judaism is at least in large part the story of attempts and failures to live up to the covenant that we made with God, a covenant that's expressed primarily through the Torah. And to the degree that we don't keep that covenant, bad things can happen, and we're not representing what the Torah says we should represent. That's not saying anything bad about the Torah. The Torah remains perfect. It's our implementation of it that remains imperfect.
Yeah, I mean, the prophetic example is particularly good because there you have the easy hiding behind like a religious veneer. Like clearly what were people saying? What do you mean I'm not from? I bring all the korbanot necessary and I volunteer more, in fact. And you need prophets to get up and say, no, actually, caring for the widow and orphan is primary, right? God is not interested in your sacrifices if you are mean to the orphan. So that's a very good example. Obviously, you could talk about contemporary applications. I definitely think that infallibility is an extremely dangerous idea. There should never be, every human being makes mistakes. And here it's remarkable because someone who reads Tanakh and Gemara should never get the wrong idea. Like every heroic character in Tanakh has a problem at some point. Like Moshe messes up and Shmuel messes up. You can go through it. David HaMelech, you can go through everybody, right? You get to the Gemara, it's the same thing. The Gemara is willing to tell some, unpleasant stories about Tanam and Amoram. And somehow we get to contemporary discourse, and rabbis never do anything wrong. Okay, I don't know how it happened, like where we went wrong. Okay, I mean, I have some theories, but that's not for us right now. But I agree, we really have to get beyond, and I would say on a dual level, both behavior and rulings. Like it could be there were mistaken rulings. Like again, rabbis are great; they try their best, but people make mistakes when they make rulings. I don't think that should be an impossibility either.
Absolutely. I mean, 2 days ago, I was reading in Sefer Yoshua about the Givonim hiding themselves and pretending that they're other people. And they made a deal with Yoshua and the rest of Am Yisrael, which they soon found out was completely mistaken. And based on mistaken premises, they made a mistake and they had to follow through, because that's what happens when you make a mistake. You now live with your mistake. It wasn't as though it's impossible that Joshua could have made such a mistake.
Right. Absolutely.
Okay. I want to widen the lens a little bit beyond our own internal Orthodox issues. And I'd like to preface this by saying that this is theoretical, and I'm not making any assertions about Israeli unethical behavior in Gaza. I am not saying that. Now, with that preface in place, I want to talk about this theoretical question, because I do think that what Israel did in Gaza is justified, even though individuals at any given point may have done things that were inappropriate. But the army on the whole has been very moral. Many Jews in and outside of Israel feel very much unfairly judged and attacked constantly. How can our community maintain solidarity under pressure while still leaving space for honest moral questioning about our own actions in wartime? I'm not questioning it myself, but that might be part of the problem. I feel that questioning it would be going past a line that's not acceptable. When and how do we do so if we don't allow ourselves to even go there?
Okay, well, that's maybe the toughest question of the day. Let me say as follows, something I've been writing about and thinking about a lot. Okay, I'm very frustrated by the polarization. And obviously, the polarization is not just an internal Jewish problem, right? Republicans and Democrats seem to be much harder for them to do any nonpartisan joint endeavor these days. But certainly that atmosphere has filtered down to the Jewish community also. And there's certain shuls, I think, which you can't discuss politics because the shul would have like a civil war between the right and the left. So one of the things I try to point out, which I not just because it's helpful, I think it's absolutely true, is that there really are extreme voices on both sides, and one of the ways of identifying them is that they always have the same position, and it's predictable. Right. There's never an occurrence where this right winger will admit that either the right did something wrong or the left has a point here. And of course, vice versa. Could have a leftist who will do the same thing. And, sometimes I'm arguing with these people on my Facebook page. That's where I encounter it. So I think, again, I'm not suggesting we throw anybody out of shul, but I think we should draw the lines in the sense that those people should not be, part of our mainstream discourse. Meaning, if we have to invite four speakers, neither of them should be one of the four. Right? We could get a wide range without them instead of those four speakers. And I guess I'll spell it out a little more. Like the right-wing extremist would be somebody who never met violence against Arabs that he was against or she was against. Right? I think we encounter people like that. Like now, even I'll even go further. Sometimes in theory they're against it, but somehow in practice it never comes up. Meaning, I'm against it, but this story was different and Baruch Goldstein was different. Okay, so that would be one. And on the other side, I think there are people who, and in the Jewish community, it's very sad, somehow never met a criticism of Israel they didn't like. Like somehow they're willing to, accept everything that's said by, the BBC and the New Yorker and it's in the UN. And it's kind of absurd, right? I think any objective observer would see that these institutions are biased against Israel. At that point, you'd have to grow skeptical about their criticism. So I'm not sure I fully answered your question, but I think I want a robust discourse, certainly where there's left and right, and there's a wide variety of opinions. But I would say there's an extreme right and extreme left that have the same answer to everything. And I don't think we should encourage them to be a major part of the discourse. They should not be invited to speak.
I would supplement that by saying it's not only that they always say the same thing and therefore it's not particularly interesting. I also would say that because it's not nuanced, they have very little to add, and it's almost more dangerous because since most people, talking about the psychological capacity for carrying multiple truths, have a difficulty with nuance, when someone says it's so simple it can be written on a bumper sticker, Unfortunately, that's usually the position that someone will be swayed by because it sounds so simple. It's so obvious. When you hear people say, oh, the solution is so obvious, the government is so stupid, the answer is so clear. The problem is that it's dangerous because it's so easy to understand. And if it were truly the answer, someone would have already implemented it. I guarantee it.
Okay, great. I have a quote and a little Dvar Torah, if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
Professor Chaim Soloveitchik, in an article, quotes Samuel Butler. It's one of the greatest quotes ever. Samuel Butler, in a novel, wrote, "Only the extremes are logical, but they are absurd." That is a great quote. And it's exactly what you said. Like, to some degree, nuance is difficult because then sometimes it's A, sometimes it's B. It's much easier to just say it's always A or it's always B. So the extremes are logical, but they're absurd, right? If anyone who really looks at the situation understands that that's not correct. So that's a great quote. In terms of Devar Torah, so many of our listeners probably know there's a Gemara in Gittin which discusses Vespasian laying siege to Jerusalem, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is snuck out to talk to him. And Vespasian is very impressed with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and he says, you know what, make a request and I'll grant you your request. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai asks for three things, right? He asks for Yavin and its sages. Apparently rabbinic leadership is crucial. And the dynasty of Rabbi Gamliel, right? They need the patriarch. And to cure a felony Rabbi Tzadok who'd been fasting. Okay, now Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yosef are critical of Yochanan ben Zakkai because they said he should have asked for the whole thing. Like, why didn't you say, leave us be this time and don't destroy the Beit HaMikdash? So the Gemara, of course, gives an answer. Obviously, what was Yochanan ben Zakkai thinking? He was thinking sometimes if you ask for everything, you get nothing. Okay, great. Now, there is another Gemara in Brachot, but it's just so tempting to connect the two. That Gemara was in Gittin. There's Gemara in Brachot which has a deathbed scene of Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai. And it says he tells his students that he's scared. He doesn't know basically if he's going to Gan Eden or Gehenna, right? It's in Kaf Chet Amud Bet, 28b. So Rav Soloveitchik said, now again, obviously one question is, Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai, like, why is he so nervous? What is he unsure of? He seems to be quite a noble and pious fellow. So it's very tempting, and Rav Soloveitchik does this in Chamesh Drasha, and the Rav speaks, where he says that he was plagued for a lifetime by had he made the right decision or not. And that is a tremendous burden to live with, right? Oh, maybe if I'd made a different call, right, the Beit HaMikdash would still be standing. And Rav Soloveitchik it's really worth reading. He plays it beautifully. He says, wait, let's look at what's happening here. He is asked to make an on-the-spot decision. It's not as if he could say, well, give me 2 weeks and I'll think it over. And he has no colleagues to consult with, right? So he gets to emphasize just how difficult that decision is. So whenever I teach this, I think about, this is a great example. Like, anybody who thinks there was an easy answer to this question is not a serious thinker, right? Again, I'm not saying you can't think there's a right answer. Obviously, you could think he should have asked the Beit HaMikdash, or no, he made the right move. But to think, oh, it's obvious, right? There's something wrong with you if you think it's obvious. And I often think that in terms of the state of Israel. Like, Rav Scott, I would never want to be prime minister. Like, the decisions you have to make are like painful. And certainly most of them do not have an easy answer. Like, even again, the last war in Gaza, like, when was it enough? Like, what was the right point to stop? Or what should the post-war government in Gaza look like? I admit, I don't know the answer to either question. I mean, again, if I'd be prime minister, I'd have to make a call. But the idea that there's a simple answer, to me, seems absurd.
If I can add one thing to what you said about that Gemara in Masechet Brachot, I believe the ending of that Gemara was as Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was on his deathbed. After this conversation, he told his students, prepare the room so nothing becomes impure, tameh, and prepare a chair for Chizkiyahu HaMelech, the king Hezekiah. Which is an interesting thing. He said he's coming. I wonder, as you're speaking, if the reason he suggested that was because Chazal also tell us that Chizkiyahu HaMelech had to make 6 decisions, and the rabbis of his time agreed with 3 of them and rejected 3 of them and said he made the wrong decision. I wonder if he's saying he's not the first person to be in a position of leadership who had to make tough decisions in wartime, and perhaps he's saying that could be a nechama, consolation to him. I'm thinking now, Chizkiyahu HaMelech was a predecessor who also had tough decisions, and they weren't always right, but he's still a righteous king.
That's a great read. You should put it in your Sefer and Agadah.
Okay.
I'm aware of, there are Achronim who discuss your point, like why does Chizkiyahu come up? I think like the Tzlach or Yechezkel Landau does, But I have not heard anyone make your suggestion. That's a very good suggestion.
Okay, thank you. And one additional point, lahavdil, about football. There is a writer on Substack named Greg Easterbrook, whom I like very much. He has a column called All Predictions Wrong. By the way, everyone should subscribe. It's excellent. During the football season, he talks about football in a column called, it's a sub-column, so to speak, called Tuesday Morning Quarterback. And he has pointed out that coaches get, in football, so much vitriol at their decisions. And he says, remember, a coach has 10 seconds to make that decision on the field in the middle of everything. So it could be the wrong decision. It could be the right decision, but he has 10 seconds. When the 10-second rule is operative, people sometimes make the wrong decision in retrospect. And what you're saying, again, lahavdil, about Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai, it's the same idea.
That's very interesting. I have to think about the football example. You might end up arguing that, the game strategy is something you could be faulted for, but the instantaneous decision is much tougher. Interesting.
I want to talk a little bit more about what happened last week, where those two female soldiers, dressed in skirts, dressed modestly, were chased down by, it was a mob. It was not a couple of people. It was a mob of hundreds of people, probably somewhat young people, but that's really not the point. Young people who clearly identify with the Haredi community. And once again, talking about the rhetoric of the rabbinic leaders that has led to it, because afterwards, immediately, the first thing that came out was almost all leadership that I saw in the Haredi community said, expel them from the community. But to me, again, that means taking no responsibility. And I want to ask you about what you would have liked them to have said, because at this point, maybe there's nothing more they can say than expel them. But what would you have liked them to say that is also reasonable to expect? Because they're not going to say, you're right, everyone should join the army.
Okay, so let's talk about a different message they could send and maybe some structural problems about the Haredi world. In terms of a different message, I think there should be some honesty that the broader Israeli public that wants the Haredim to do the army are not out to get Haredim. I'm not saying there aren't individual people who hate Haredim, of course, but really at least acknowledge that the complaint is justified. Like if your community has people doing hundreds of days of miluim, if your community has lost, 7 boys from the community, or 7 soldiers, I should say, so they have a reason to say you should be serving. So stop with the rhetoric that they're out to close down Torah, or it's Shmad, as I said, it's religious persecution, as in, the Spanish Inquisition or Tsarist Russia. Like, admit that that's not true. Like, again, I'm not even saying give up your position. You could still say, I have reason to think that Talmud Torah is more important, or we need to keep the Haredi way of life going. Again, I obviously don't agree, but but say that. But don't say that they're out to get you, or don't convey that the other side is evil. That I think is really just not justified. Now, again, the tricky thing is, as we're saying, like after the fact of the mob, it's too late, right? That should have been the discourse all the way through. And maybe, hopefully, there could be some realization. Maybe leadership will say, we can't exactly say Yadeinu lo shafchu et hadam hazeh. And we do have to tone down the rhetoric, but I'm not so optimistic at this point. I would like to make a structural point also, and hopefully there'll be a greater realization of this. Some of the problem here is not just how they talk about secular Zionism or the state, but what are the options in the Haredi community? And most things in life are double-edged. So when you have a very intense focus on one value, obviously it helps you promote that value, but it could be really problematic for all the things that are outside that one item. So I would say if you're a man in the Haredi world, right, pretty much the currency of success is being good at Gemara. That is pretty much, that's what again, yeshiva, make it very simple. Every boy is supposed to be in yeshiva, and every yeshiva is learning Gemara all day. Okay, so at that point, there's only one thing to be good at. But that's extremely destructive at the end of the day. Like, even if we're super intellectual and academic, like there are other things in the world of learning. What if someone doesn't like Gemara but really is good at Tanakh, or likes, Machshava, or even what we had before? Like, what if they like the stories of the Gemara? They want to be an expert in Agadah. So there really isn't such a place for that in the Haredi orbit. But then it gets worse. What if you're not academic at all? Like, what if you're a good person, but you just, whatever, you can't sit for that long. You're not, unfortunately, that intellectually gifted. Right? There needs to be other ways to shine. And one of the things you'll have in a modern Orthodox high school is, you could also be good at secular studies. You could be good at art. You could be good at music. You could be good at drama. You could be on the basketball team. Now, again, there is something to be said for the Haredi intensity. No, no, no. We don't do our music. We just learn Torah. But you have to realize there's a flip side. There is fallout. And I would say I go one last step. And even for those who can learn Gemara, maybe they also need a break occasionally. Maybe they need a physical outlet. Maybe if they played basketball, it would be good. And here, this strike, I always struck by the contrast between American Haredim and Israeli Haredim. I went to an American Haredi high school. There was no sense whatsoever that playing sports was bad. No sense, right? The yeshiva had a basketball court. We loved playing basketball, right? And no one looked down at us. Obviously, if you played basketball during Seder time, that wasn't good. Okay, but you were not looked down upon for playing basketball during the break. Okay, I think, I guess I'll state this, I don't know if it's true, but I think most Israeli yeshiva do not have a basketball court. Okay, and it is not encouraged that if that mere guys in their spare time will go play basketball. So now let me bring this all back home. So if you have a lot of people who are frustrated and not succeeding in the Beit Midrash and don't have other outlets, that's going to come out somewhere, right? And they're looking for, I might say this right, they're looking for action. Unfortunately, the action might be, mob behavior. So here, I would really love if the Haredim would, A, keep their positions, but stop portraying their opponents as, enemies of Torah. It's just false. And secondly, find some way to broaden the possibilities for a yeshiva guy. Like there must be some way to find success and feel good about yourself, even if you can't plow through Chesed Rabatim.
You see, I actually agree with what you said, though I would take it a little bit further and disagree on another point, which is that at least in my experience, which admittedly is purely anecdotal, my kids went to Dati Leumi schools. And yet for the boys, it still was true that proficiency and success in Gemara was the ultimate arbiter of, I'm going to say this, how good a person you are. I don't mean that they say that consciously, but that's how it comes across. The best kids, the top kids, if you want to use that term, though that's not a term they're using, it's implicitly there, are the ones who sit and have no problem learning in Seder and who are successful in learning Gemara. And those boys who have a harder time in learning Gemara, because it's the Dati Leumi community, there are other paths they can go. But in high school, at least, they are considered less successful. The fact that they might be good at math, or they might be good at English, or they might be good at basketball does make them, so to speak, lower on the totem pole. And I think that's a creeping Haredization of some of our high schools. Again, anecdotal, my own experience, which is limited. I have 3 sons, and that's the only experience I have here. But I'm afraid that it might be true in a way that we have to be careful about.
Okay, I agree with your point, but I'm going to tone it down a bit. And maybe we should do another podcast on Torah beyond Gemara. That might be a good podcast.
For sure.
But I still think if you look at who's a public figure in our world, you could be a public figure in a Torah context without it being about Gemara. Like in Tanakh, you would point to Yoni Grossman. You would point to Rav Yoel Ben Nun. You would point to Rav Amnon Bazak. Now, it's not that these people are ignoramuses in Gemara, but they make their mark in the world of Tanakh, and they are very popular speakers. In the world of Machshava, you might talk about, Rav Yuval Shurlo or Rav Avram Stav, right? Now, again, I'm not saying the Haredi community has nobody who teaches Tanakh and Machshava, but I do think it's easier to find a place in our world, and even in a leadership role, without having to be a Gemara person.
Okay, let's conclude, Rabbi Blau, by bringing it back home to our initial talk and our main talk today. And I could sit and talk to you for hours. We were talking about confronting the extremists, confronting the crazies, if I want to make it a little bit alliterative. What would you say as a summation? What should we, as individuals, not necessarily as leaders, the people listening, what should we all be doing when we see people advocating things that are not acceptable? You already said that we should say, hey, that's not okay, and tell them at our Shabbos table, don't say that. Is there anything else you can suggest as a way forward, as a practical piece of guidance of how, I'll broaden it, both leaders and lay people should move forward to make our community better than it is right now?
Okay, so as you said, maybe I shouldn't repeat what I've said already, but just to build up a little steam. So obviously, public statements are helpful. The dinner table conversation, the shul conversation is helpful. Courage is certainly helpful. And before I get to a fourth category, I think I want to harp on this. I really think we have to emphasize courage a bit more than we do in our community. that it's a value. And courage need not be, if I could just, give PR for an article I wrote. I wrote an article in Tradition called Courage as a Jewish Value. And I think we don't talk about it enough. And it's not just on the battlefield. As we're saying, like, let's say you say something that offends the guy across the row from you in shul. You're not in danger as a result. Like, it's not that your life's threatened, but it takes a certain amount of courage. I was just thinking about this the other day. There's a Jewish newspaper in America that prints anonymous letters. And I was thinking, unless the person's in real danger, there's no excuse for printing anonymous letters. Like, a person should have the wherewithal and the courage to back up his words. And I think if our community is not standing for that, it's a big problem. I guess the fourth thing I would say would be to become knowledgeable, right? Often we have like a little bit of an intuition, but we don't know how to like realize that intuition in real life or in concrete arguments. And some of the key is, reading good people. Right. So you might have, I imagine someone who says, I don't really like the violence against the Palestinians, but I don't really know. I'm not an expert in Hilchos Malachim or Hilchos Milchama. So I would say, okay, so find a rabbinic voice that you value, that you respect, and see what he has to say. Like, ask yourself, I don't know, how does Rav Shula relate about this? Or how does Rav Moshe Lichtenstein write about this? Now, again, I admit I'm picking certain names, but that's by definition, that's what you're doing here. Like, everybody has to pick some name, right? Again, you want to get some broad range, but at the end of the day, there's certain rabbis you identify with more. So I would say maybe courage and education are the two messages to end with, right? Don't be afraid to make people upset. And two, but become a learned person, or both in Torah and in the political situation.
That's a very important message. In fact, I happened to see an old public service announcement from the Ad Council from maybe 30 years ago. This past week, I just looked at it for whatever reason. It was about domestic violence, really. And it was an apartment. And you see a husband and wife in bed, and you hear coming from clearly the room upstairs, a husband yelling and clearly hurting his wife. And the husband and wife that you see in the frame are just silent, looking at each other, clearly very, very upset, but obviously quite reluctant to interfere. At the end, the husband just turns off the light, and the tagline is something like, "It is your business." And I think we have to use that tagline for us. It is our business when it comes to courage. And just to make a final point, that idea that courage is a Jewish value is so crucial. Rav Soloveitchik says in one of those 5 famous essays that were published in Tradition in 1978, it might have been The Community or Majesty and Humility, I don't remember, but he says that heroism is essentially the central halachic value. As a bonus question for our Orthodox Conundrum Commentary paid subscribers, I'd like to ask you the following. What religious or philosophical question do you answer differently now than you did, say, 10 years ago or 20 years ago?
Wow. I like this new feature, the bonus question. I think I am more aware of the difficulties of affirming belief.
To hear the rest of Rabbi Blau's very nuanced answer and my response to him as well, make sure you sign up as a paid subscriber to Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. The link is in the show notes. Rabbi Blau, thank you so much for joining me today. This was so interesting, a really marvelous conversation, and of course you embody the courage that you advocate, so it's a pleasure to speak with you today.
It was a great conversation.
I'd like to offer a word of thanks to our Patreon supporters. Patreon functions as a voluntary tip jar for Jewish Coffee House and our family of podcasts. Patreon supporters at all levels, as well as paid subscribers to Orthodox Conundrum Commentary, will have access to our upcoming private Q&A sessions. Your support in either place helps sustain thoughtful Jewish conversation. Additional bonus material, including the longer episodes with bonus questions, is available to paid subscribers of Orthodox Conundrum Commentary on Substack. No matter how you choose to support this work, we are deeply grateful. Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been the Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.